Today, we are looking at 4 more objections to the resurrection of Jesus, and why these alternative theories do not hold up to scholarly criticism or philosophical scrutiny. According to atheistic philosopher Anthony Flew, he says, and I quote, "The evidence for the resurrection is better than for claimed miracles in any other religion. It's outstandingly different in quality and quantity." End quote. With that in mind, let's discuss the following theories. We will begin by talking about the spiritual resurrection theory. The spiritual resurrection theory claims that Jesus did not physically rise from the dead, but instead Jesus only rose quote-unquote spiritually. The theory posits that the followers of Jesus had a spiritual or non-bodily experience of Jesus after his death. According to this view, the resurrection could be symbolic, psychological, or mystical, but not material or physical. The problem with the quote-unquote spiritual resurrection theory is that it's anachronistic, because to a first century Jew in the Second Temple period, a resurrection was bodily in their minds. The scholar James D.G. Dunn even says, and I quote, "It is an indisputable fact that the earliest Christians believed that Jesus was raised from the dead." End quote. Therefore, a non-physical resurrection would have no meaning in a Jewish worldview. A group called the Gnostics wanted to push the spiritual resurrection theory, but it didn't work, because Christianity is a physical resurrection religion, not just a spiritual one. A resurrection to a Jew and a Christian requires a material body. A non-physical resurrection would be a contradiction in the minds of both first century Jews and Christians. According to our earliest sources, when Jesus rose from the dead, he was not like a ghost, or a spirit, or a shade, or a wraith, or a soul, or a ghoul, specter, phantom, apparition, or poltergeist. The disciples described a bodily, in-time resurrection, which neither Greeks nor Jews expected. Greeks thought the body was bad, and Jews thought the body would be resurrected physically on the last day of judgment. Lydia McGrew, who is a trained philosophical epistemologist, is correct when she argues that Jesus being raised from the dead physically aligns with naturalism until you debate what or who caused Jesus to rise from the dead. Her point seems to be that God the Father could have used a physical cause to raise Jesus from the dead, so naturalists can actually agree with Christians that Jesus rose from the dead based on the evidence, even though the naturalists do not know the cause behind the resurrection, unlike Christians who would say that God the Father rose Jesus. The scholar Michael Licona has also made similar comments that materialists can agree that Jesus was risen from the dead even if they do not know how. In Second Temple Judaism, resurrection, or anastasis, especially in the New Testament context, refers to a bodily event, not a ghost-like or spiritual afterlife. The concept of a purely spiritual resurrection would have been foreign and confusing to first century Jews. If Jesus' followers wanted to say his spirit lived on, they would have simply written that Jesus has been exalted, or that Jesus was taken up to heaven, but they wouldn't have written that he was resurrected, quote unquote. Because in this context, resurrection naturally implies a material body. Now, some people appeal to 1 Corinthians 15 to support a spiritual resurrection hypothesis, particularly Paul's phrase about a quote-unquote spiritual body. But Paul actually contrasts a natural, or a better translation would be a perishable body, with a spiritual or glorified or imperishable body. Paul does not say that the glorified body is immaterial or incorporeal, but rather that this spiritual body is imperishable and material. To have a body is to imply physicality. So when Paul refers to a spiritual body, he is explaining that this new physical body is going to be incorruptible or imperishable, but not ghostly or ethereal. Paul, being a Jew himself and using the word for body, which is something that ghosts and spirits don't need, Paul is conveying that the resurrected bodies of believers at the end of time are physical, just like how Jesus' body was physical even after Jesus rose from the dead. Paul also says Jesus was, quote, buried, raised, and appeared to many, suggesting a continuity between the natural body and the risen, glorified body. If the apostles were just promoting a spiritual idea, there would have been no reason to speak so boldly about eyewitness testimony, Jesus eating, Jesus wanting people to touch him, or Jesus' physical body missing from the tomb. Luke chapter 24 verse 39 says this, and I quote, "See my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Touch me and see. For a spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have." End quote. If the disciples were proposing a non-physical resurrection and only a resurrection of the spirit of Jesus, then the body could have still been in the tomb. We should also remember that the language of the early church was historical, not metaphorical, in regards to the resurrection body. According to New Testament historian N.T. Wright, he says, and I quote, "Nobody in the Jewish world of the first century ever imagined that resurrection meant going to heaven or becoming a spirit. Resurrection always meant the reversal of death, the gift of a new body, real and physical, after a time of being truly dead." End quote. Ultimately, the spiritual resurrection theory does not explain the facts of the empty tomb, the physical resurrection appearances, or the Jewish framework that would reject a purely spiritual resurrection, because again, to a Jew, a spiritual resurrection would be a contradiction in terms, and that's why the spiritual resurrection theory fails. The next theory is what I call the beliefism theory. The beliefism theory states that the only thing needed for Christianity to have exploded in popularity is the belief that Jesus rose, but not that Jesus actually rose from the dead. Now, this theory does not explain fact 2 of Jesus' missing body from the tomb, or fact 3, which states that people interacted with Jesus after his death. However, the main problem with this theory is that it's not much of a theory at all. A theory in this context should explain how the belief started, and not that the belief is already present. The theory assumes that there is a belief in the resurrection of Jesus at that time, but the theory doesn't explain how the belief itself originated. People argued that the belief in Jesus' resurrection is purely a matter of faith, that there is no historical evidence to support it. This theory suggests that Christians don't need historical facts, just spiritual conviction. But this perspective raises some serious issues, especially when we look closely at what the early followers of Jesus actually claimed and how Christianity spread. The writers of the New Testament never portray the resurrection as a blind leap of faith. Instead, they ground their message in eyewitness testimony of reliable people who witnessed real events. Christianity is not just about a helpful philosophy or positive feelings. It stands or falls on the historical truth of the resurrection, not just a belief of a resurrection. Believing something doesn't make it the truth. The truth of a belief depends on its object. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then no amount of sincere belief changes that reality. Christianity calls for a reasonable faith, not blind faith. If the resurrection didn't happen in history, then the gospel is reduced to a myth or a symbol. That's not how the apostles preached. They proclaimed a risen Lord who physically walked out of the grave. Belief in the gospel has power because it's rooted in truth, not in emotional comfort. A non-Christian Jewish scholar named Pinchas Lapid, who taught at Hebrew University, stated the following, and I quote, "I accept the resurrection of Jesus not as an invention of the community of disciples, but as a historical event." End quote. This non-Christian scholar is convinced of the facts of the resurrection of Jesus on the basis of historical evidence and not beliefism. This shows that the facts of history portray the resurrection of Jesus not only as a great hypothesis, but are convincing enough to persuade non-Christians. Now, it should be noted, however, that Pincus Lapide is not a Christian, but he does believe in the resurrection. However, believing in facts and believing in Jesus for salvation are soteriologically different. The non-Christian scholar Raymond E. Brown says the following, and I quote, "Even the most skeptical historian must do one thing to account for the fact that Christianity began and spread so rapidly. Explain the impact of Jesus' resurrection belief." End quote. Brown's comment leads me to believe that people cannot simply assume the beliefism theory, that people would randomly believe in the gospel without a reason to believe in it. Something must have convinced the disciples and others to hold a countercultural belief of a murdered Messiah who rose from the dead. For all of those reasons and more, that is why the beliefism theory fails. Now I want to talk about the legendary developments theory. The legendary developments theory claims that Jesus did not rise from the dead, but that the resurrection story gradually evolved over decades through oral tradition, exaggeration, and myth-making. The most well-known legendary development theory says that Jesus was originally a wise teacher who helped people by healing their bodies or minds by using medicine or mental conditioning techniques. Over time, stories about the teachings of Jesus and his healings became amplified, which caused the stories to sound far more extraordinary than what may have actually happened. However, this does not pass the plausibility test based on the following quotes from scholars. Quote, "The formation of the appearance traditions mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 3-8 falls into the time between 30 and 33 CE. That's a quote by Gerrit Ludemann, a New Testament scholar who's also an atheist. To echo this sentiment, the atheist A.N. Sherwin-White, who is a scholar of ancient Roman and Greek history at Oxford University, says the following. He argues that even a span of 2 generations is not sufficient for a legend to wipe out a solid core of historical facts. The picture of Jesus in the New Testament was established well within that length of time." End quote. Essentially, the writings happened soon enough after the events to where major legendary developments would not be admissible. Even if legendary developments did infiltrate the stories, the disciples themselves would have still been alive to correct any exaggeration or error. Legendary development relies on stories evolving in contexts removed from the original events themselves. But people like Paul, Peter, James, and John were alive and preaching when the Gospels and epistles were being circulated, so they could correct legendary developments or errors if there were any. The resurrection message in Paul's letters, also known as epistles, which were written around the 50s AD, aligns closely with the accounts in the Gospels, which were written between 60 and 90 AD, if not earlier. In ancient Judaism, a crucified Messiah was a contradiction in terms. It meant the person was cursed by God, according to Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 23. Legends are usually created to honor heroes, not to explain how a failed crucified leader was rewarded by God for dying. Or perhaps the disciples themselves started these legends. However, it seems that if the disciples were inventing legends, they wouldn't have fabricated a story so radically different from their culture's expectation. You should also know that the resurrection narrative was not borrowed from pagan myths either. No prior Greco-Roman myth features a bodily resurrection of an actual historical person. This was a new concept that changed theology, not a recycled legend. One popular internet claim says that the story of Jesus was just copied from gods like Horus, Mithras, or Dionysus. But when you actually investigate these comparisons, they fall apart fast. Horus was not born of a virgin, did not have 12 disciples, and was not crucified. The story of Mithras comes centuries later and has essentially no direct parallels to Jesus. Claims of resurrection, virgin births, or miracles in mythologies are often misrepresented, exaggerated, come after Jesus, or are used in mythology to express crop cycles. Scholars specializing in ancient religion reject these parallels and the legendary developments theory as shallow and historically inaccurate. Lund University professor and biblical scholar T.N.D. Mettinger wrote the following, and I quote, "The consensus among modern scholars is that there were no dying and rising gods that preceded Christianity. They all post-dated the 1st century." End quote. The story of Jesus stands on a completely different foundation, rooted in 1st century Jewish history, not mythological folklore or legend. Even the genre of the literature itself regarding the epistles and the gospels were written to convey history and not mythology. But what if the legends got in before the gospels were written down? Some people will say that the passing on of the Gospels in verbal form before they were written down was like the game of telephone, but this analogy fails in multiple ways. Number 1, the telephone game is meant to distort, while ancient oral tradition was meant to preserve. Number 2, the Gospels were written within the lifetime of eyewitnesses. Number 3, the message was repeated constantly and publicly, not whispered in secret. Point number 4, there were multiple sources and accounts, not a single line of transmission. Point number 5, early Christians were deeply concerned with preserving truth. And lastly, point number 6, ancient cultures were skilled in memorization. The game of telephone or Chinese whispers may sound like a good objection, but it completely misrepresents how the message of Jesus was transmitted in the ancient world. The telephone game and Chinese whispers assume a casual, unreliable process of secret whispering, while in reality, early Christian transmission was communal, public, guarded, memorized, and written down within the lifetime of eyewitnesses. The Gospels did not evolve like folklore. They were anchored in early testimony, preserved with care, and confirmed by multiple independent sources. The scholar Femi Perkins mentioned the following about how early the New Testament sources were by writing, "The conviction that Jesus had been raised from the dead and appeared to his followers is part of the earliest layer of Christian tradition predating the Gospels." End quote. In the end, the legendary developments theory is not taken seriously by scholars and ultimately collapses under the weight of the evidence for the resurrection. Lastly, we will discuss the Mythicism view. The Mythicism view, which is often called the Christ myth theory, argues that Jesus of Nazareth never existed as a historical figure, and that stories about him were entirely invented or borrowed from pagan mythology. The Mythicism view is similar to the legendary developments view. However, there are very large differences. Both of these are unique enough to where we need to discuss both of them. In the legendary developments view, we stated that there were historical stories about Jesus which became more exaggerated over time as legendary developments crept in. But on the other hand, the Mythicism view states that there was never a historical foundation for Jesus to begin with. This view is not taken seriously by the overwhelming majority of historians, including secular historians, because it faces numerous critical issues. The most glaring problem that this theory faces is that it denies all 12 facts that are agreed upon by the majority of cynical, non-Christian New Testament scholars and historians. Just listen to what scholars have to say about this view. They say, and I quote, "We can be certain that Jesus really existed, despite a few highly motivated skeptics who refuse to be convinced. That he was a Jewish teacher in Galilee, and that he was crucified by the Roman government around 30 CE. That is from a liberal scholar named Robert J. Miller. We could even take Bart Ehrman, for example, because he's an agnostic/atheistic New Testament scholar and critic of Christianity, even though he says that the idea that Jesus never existed is not just wrong, it's fringe and unsupported by serious evidence." End quote. We have multiple independent sources that confirm his existence, such as Tacitus, Josephus, Pliny the Younger, Suetonius, Lucian of Samosata, Clement of Rome, Ignatius, Polycarp, Justin Martyr, and others. Also, Paul knew people who actually walked and talked with Jesus, to where even Paul himself says that he has seen the risen Lord. In Paul's letter to the Galatians, Paul says that he met James, whom he calls the brother of the Lord. He also knew Peter, one of Jesus' top disciples. This isn't a myth. This is a direct, personal connection to those who lived alongside Jesus. One reason historians take the Gospels seriously is that they are grounded in actual history. Names like Pontius Pilate, Caiaphas, and Herod are real people verified by archaeology and secular records. Locations like Nazareth, Jerusalem, and the Sea of Galilee still exist and match the geography described in these accounts verbatim. Even details like the use of Roman titles and taxes line up with what we know from ancient sources. Let's be candid. Roman crucifixion was a humiliating, degrading way to die, and really crucifixion of any sort was terrible. In Jewish culture, it meant being cursed by God, so why would early Christians invent a Messiah who died that way? If they were making up a story, they'd probably describe Jesus as a victorious king or military hero, not someone who suffered one of the worst deaths imaginable. Historians call this the criterion of embarrassment, which is when a detail is awkward or damaging, which means that it's more likely to be historically authentic. Even one of the top mythicists in the world, named Richard Carrier, says the following, and I quote, "Even if Jesus didn't exist, the origin of Christianity still must be explained by the belief that someone had risen from the dead." End quote. We also have great indication that the story of Jesus wasn't a copy of a myth, because the first century Gospels and the book of Acts are historically accurate in many regards, unlike the Greek and Roman myths of that time. Lastly, to quote a Harvard scholar named Helmut Koster, he says the following, and I quote, "The resurrection appearances of Jesus are historical events. They cannot be dismissed as mere myth or fabrication." End quote. In the end, the mythicism view that Jesus never existed fails for the reasons given against it from scholarship and history. With that being said, remember to press the like button and subscribe to this channel for more videos just like this one, because we are just getting started. With that being said, I will see you over in the next video.